My name is George Friedman, and I'm here with Robert Kaplan. As many of you know, Robert Kaplan joined Stratfor several months ago, and we're delighted to have him. And one of the reasons that we're so pleased to have him is that he disagrees with us. Not on fundamental things, not on the fundamental way you think about the world or you look at the world, but on many analyses we do of certain countries, like Iran, and some methods that we use, such as forecasting. As all of you know, I believe that it is possible to forecast geopolitical events. The name of the company is Strategic Forecasting, and I chose that name with some care 16 years ago. Now, I think that it's possible to forecast things because of what we call constraints. There are things that are impossible. In fact, most things are impossible. And when you analyze them carefully, the number of things that are possible become very few. And it's possible to see among them which is the most likely path. You can't do it perfectly, you can't do it all the time, but it can be done. That's my view. If you take the presidency of Barack Obama, he profoundly wanted, subjectively, to change George W. Bush's foreign policy. I don't think he was hypocritical in that. I don't think that he was simply being clever. He really wanted and believed he could have a different foreign policy. In point of fact, the differences turn out to be very small. The relationship with Europe is pretty much what it was under George W. Bush. The war in Iraq ended, but George W. Bush was ending it already. The situation in Afghanistan, if anything, is harder than it was before. The subjective desires of President Obama, his policies, and what actually happened were two different things. And paying attention to policies is misleading. It's what actually happens. And we had thought before the election, and we had said that there would not be that much difference between Bush and Obama. Now, that doesn't mean that forecasting always works. And one of the things I'd like to discuss today with Robert is where he thinks it works, where he thinks it doesn't work, and where he thinks Stratfor is going wrong. Robert?
Well, George, obviously I agree with forecasting to a certain extent. I've just published a book on geography, which is all about geographical constraints and geographical opportunities. However, here's the problem. It's all about geography and economics and vast impersonal forces and constraints until it's all about Shakespeare. And it's all about, the Shakespearean depths of individual policymakers and and how they're likely to act. For instance, in Washington, it's also true that who you are depends upon who you appoint. It turned out that Obama appointed Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, who's pursued a harder line than had he appointed Senator John Kerry, and she appointed Kurt Campbell as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, who's pursued a very hard, pragmatic line on East Asia and China. You shuffle those cards a bit, and you get different people at the different assistant secretaries levels. You could come out with a very different policy. The most famous example of that is when President Bill Clinton, in his first term, changed the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and appointed Richard Holbrooke to replace the basically ineffectual person who preceded him. And Holbrooke was a real bully who went around knocking heads off and brought the war in Bosnia to an end. That was a force of nature that filled the vacuum. That's an example of individual human agency. And that's why it's easier for Stratfor, say, to prognosticate how shale, for instance, will affect geopolitics around the world, or how coal may affect geopolitics around the world, or the outlook for the Iranian economy over the next 5 or 10 years, than it is for Stratfor to predict what's in Ehud Barak's head and whether or not he's bluffing or really intends to do some kind of a strike. Yes, there are constraints on someone like Barak, and what Stratfor does is outline those constraints. But within those constraints, there are still many possibilities available that could lead to very different outcomes.
Let's take the Holbrooke example. What I would argue was that, tragic as Bosnia was, it wasn't that important. The really important question was, what was the Russian relationship going to be with Europe and the United States after Boris Yeltsin? And that was the unfolding issue. And Holbrooke achieved a couple of things. First, he focused on an issue that mattered, but not in the global sense. He avoided the really difficult issue, Russia. In fact, in the way he handled some of the issues in Yugoslavia, I think he helped bring down Yeltsin, helped bring Putin to power. But then I would argue that Putin was going to come to power anyway, and if not Putin, someone very like him. The idea that Russia was going to remain this prostrate cripple for an extended period of time without the security apparatus reasserting itself was unlikely. I've no doubt in my mind that policies are very different in Washington. I have real doubts about whether or not those policies matter very much in the long run. And inside of Washington, that's all you hear. You go to Washington, you go to London, you constantly hear who is appointed and who is made, and they come and go, and they are very important to each other. But in terms of shaping the past 20 years, it's not shale, but the reemergence of Russia. Could it have been managed better? Could it have been managed worse? I find that policymakers are most effective in relatively unimportant issues that don't intersect many things. And particularly in a tragedy like Bosnia, where they can make a difference. But they don't manage the broad sweep of history.
All right, let me give you some counter-arguments to that. First of all, what I call the Rumsfeld-Dan Coates argument, which is Dan Coates was slated to be the Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush, and he failed his interview or something. And Bush was flailing around for someone they needed, and Rumsfeld seemed to be a very uncontroversial, safe choice because he had already been Secretary of Defense and had done a very good job at it. So there was no risk in appointing Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld brought in Wolfowitz, whereas Dan Coates would have brought in Richard Armitage, and the whole decade could have been different. Because either we wouldn't have gone to war in Iraq, or if we did, it would have been different. It would have been pivotally different in certain
But
ways. And wait, there are some other examples too. By going into Bosnia in the way we did and doing Kosovo the way we did, we were able to expand NATO to the Black Sea. Because it solved temporarily the security problem in the Balkans. So had we not done those two wars, things could have been marketably different. Another example, Stratfor never could have predicted that Lon Nol, the Cambodian dictator in 1970, was going to have a partial stroke soon after. And because he had a partial stroke, he was able to remain in power, but remain in power very weakly, and that helped Khmer Rouge come to power. Had Lon Nol been a totally healthy man, we might have had a different outcome.
Well, let's take that case. Let's take firstly the case of Dan Coates. In the first place, the selection of these people took place in a complete vacuum because the president had no idea what policy he was going to be dealing with. He was going to be dealing with something he didn't expect, 9/11. Secondly, the options after Afghanistan were basically to go into defensive crouch or continue to assault the Islamic world. From a political standpoint, going into domestic crouch at 2003 really wasn't an option. So the pressures that Rumsfeld may have been more enthusiastic about doing these things, but the pressures were there. I'm always reminded of the obsession with only Kennedy had lived, we wouldn't have gone to Vietnam.
I agree with you there. I know where you're taking
well,
this.
Well, where I'm taking it is,
yeah.
Here's a case where the appointees matter.
Yeah.
But it's not just the appointees. The appointees represented a basic mindset about American power, about how it should be exercised, what the threat was, and what the behavior should be. So when I look at these people, when I look at Holbrooke, when I consider their behavior, they're trapped in a social matrix. These are not men with unique ideas parachuting in. They're part of a group of ideas, and you go to any bar in Washington, you'll encounter the ideas in watered-down form or various forms.
But some people have stronger, more assertive personalities than others, and that affects outcomes.
And what I will argue is that in an administration, within this matrix, various people will have strong personalities, and they will be the ones we remember. and we will think they caused it to happen. Whereas in my mind, they're the agents of underlying causes. But I think your point is well taken. I mean, the real debate we're having is Shakespeare versus
Yes.
the Greeks.
Yeah.
Shakespeare writes as if men have choices, and Greek tragedy is about the limits of choices. And that's really where we're kind of taking this.
Yes, it is. And it's about, well, policymaking works best when policymakers are able to play at the edges of what's possible without going over the line. But at the end of the day, it's easier to predict long-range things because, as you said, if you're looking over a century, it's all about geography. If you're looking over 10 years, it's about personalities.
And I think that's true. But even within those 10 years, let's take the case of Holbrooke extending NATO. Given the fall of the Soviet Union, we were going to be extending power to its limits. And inevitably, that was going to cause a reaction in the Russians. The extent to which Holbrooke's policies were predictable, yes, we would all extend. And the response, Russia would change its behavior back again, I think were predictable. And I think we did predict it. What we can't predict, and I think you're right, I mean, the closer the time frame, the less predictable it gets. But we could say things during the Arab Spring, for example, that the Egyptian rising did not unseat the military, even though it had unseated the president. There are things that can be said, and I think you're right. The closer the time frame, the less you can say. But 10 years, I think we can still say things.
In 1993, I published an article in The Atlantic saying that Syria was just a webwork of sectarian tensions, and that the reason the Syrian regime was so anti-Israeli was precisely to hide the sectarian tensions within it. It had to appeal to a pan-Arab sensibility in order to justify itself as a state. So you can get that basic assumption right if you're given enough time. But now that we're in this Syrian civil war, predicting when Assad falls and how he falls and how it unravels, gets very, very difficult because you're dealing with, you're dealing with the personalities, the Shakespearean depths of Assad and the 20 or 30 people around him who may bolt at any one moment or may not. And that's where forecasting gets very, very difficult.
But we can say certain things even about that. That there are powerful forces that don't want a Sunni and a radical Sunni regime coming into power from outside, and in the Arab world as well. Second, that many want the regime to survive, but that they don't want Assad to head it. So we can say this much, I think. There are very powerful forces. The United States, I think, has this position. Many of the European countries have this position, that the outcome they prefer is the regime's survival, Assad's departure. No one prefers the one that may happen, which is turning, as you've said, turning Syria into another Lebanon.
Yes,
where
into
Assad
a greater
survives,
Lebanon.
Where Assad survives in his war. We can't predict which of those things will happen, but we can describe with some precision, I think, the preferred outcomes. Those preferences aren't that one day the president got out of bed and said he likes that one better than this one. It has to do with constraints on him. We can start understanding the things that they're going to do, and we can measure the relative strength on either side of the outcome. Now, I think you're totally right. You cannot predict the precise nature of the outcome, but you can get close to understanding the dynamics.
Yes, and forecasting, I think, really has a challenge when you're dealing with will the Israelis strike Iran or not. Now, of course, there are constraints. We know Israel cannot do a comprehensive attack, so that's one constraint. Another thing, it will be very hard for the Israelis to surprise the Americans, who will have all kinds of electronic sensors and all of that. That's another constraint. A third constraint is the whole situation in the Strait of Hormuz. that the Iranians may have the ability to upset the world economy, at least over the short run. These are all behavioral constraints. But once you get down to it, saying like between now and the November elections, Israel will do nothing. This is all just a psyops campaign, or Israel will do a limited strike to ignite the Americans to do a comprehensive. Once you get 4 or 5 choices there, it gets very hard to forecast.
If you have 4 or 5 choices, but if you look at the Israeli situation, which 2 things that you point out. First, the Israeli Air Force is really, I think this is somewhat beyond it, the complexity of the strike. They could attempt it, but the risks are there. Second, the Straits of Hormuz being closed would result in the end of the global recovery. And Israel would suffer political consequences to that. Between the probability that they would fail, the possibility that they would fail, and the possibility that they would be blamed and totally alienated from the national system for trying it, I don't look to what is in Netanyahu's head, because Netanyahu heads a cabinet government. He's also dealing with military people, his intelligence community. He's dealing with the Americans. So I try to do what I call empathetic analysis, which is not touchy-feely, to put myself into his head. And what I see is not a man who feels free to make the choice that he wants, but is beset on all sides by pressures. And the choice that he's going to make is going to be a compendium of these pressures. So I would argue that looking at the risks that he takes, he neither has the power nor the will to take that risk, which is why this is the 3rd or 4th time in the past few years that we've gone through this exercise. You may well be right that he could surprise us all. And that's, I think, the point of our disagreement, which is, I think, a pretty serious and important one, which is that I think that I believe in the rational actor and therefore the predictable actor on the whole. And you?
I would say that what seems neat or mathematically neat and ordered in your analysis is not so mathematically neat and ordered. The Americans have been moving minesweepers into the Straits of Hormuz. They've been almost getting ready for an Israeli attack. It won't be so easy for the Iranians to close the strait. And it's also not clear that Israel would be blamed for it. If Israel launches a limited attack and Iran responds by trying to close the straits, then Iran might be blamed more than Israel, because that would send oil prices up, and the Chinese and the Indians would be mad as heck at the Iranians. So your analysis briefs well. But I think when you break it down into its individual parts, there are choices within choices within choices.
Now, when you take a look, however...
And assumptions within assumptions within assumptions.
Well, and this is the problem for Netanyahu. So, for example, the question of a limited strike. Firstly, the Israeli experience with the Israeli Air Force in 2006 during the war with Hezbollah was not happy. The performance of Israel was not particularly impressive. And Netanyahu has to be considering that, firstly, it's the military warning him in many cases against it. And secondly, how much confidence does he have in them? Secondly, how much confidence do we have in our Navy to be able to clear the straits? It's possible, but we live in a world of probabilities, as you put it. And it's those probabilities that really push the policymaker to ask the question, what risks can I afford to take? I see them as most policymakers, particularly in our time, as extraordinarily cautious and averse to risk, and therefore somewhat more predictable. There's a certain level at which it becomes total chaos. And I think we disagree what the level is.
All right, that's one way that Netanyahu might be seeing it, but he may be making other assumptions. For instance, in a way, the 2006 war in Lebanon was good news for Israel, because it was a failed campaign where a lot of the parts didn't perform well, yet it was not catastrophic, and it allowed a small country to bear down on its problems and fix a lot of them. Which is much easier to do for a small, determined country than a big one with a vast bureaucracy. So Israel's made a lot of progress since 2006. Also, An air naval campaign is the kind of thing the United States does well. It's ground counterinsurgency, which is another thing we disagree on, but that's another subject. It's ground counterinsurgency that the United States doesn't do well at. So it's not to get off the subject, but it's not as cut and dry. These things are far more complex. It just makes analysis, forecasting more imperfect the closer you get in a time frame. The longer the time frame, I would say, the easier it is to forecast because you're dealing with broad currents and trends. But the closer in the time frame, the more of an inexact science and more of an art it becomes rather than a science.
And I will argue, in closing, that it is a science in this sense. You've said that we're better at airland campaigns.
Air-sea campaign.
Air-sea campaign. We haven't really tried one in a very long time. There are assumptions we make before all of our wars, sometimes, as in Desert Storm, that assumes that we're worse than we are, and the enemy's stronger, and some, Iraq, that we're better than we are. And each political leader has to draw this question: how much does he trust his military? We're at a historical moment where the civilian trust of the military, rightly or wrongly, is low. And I think that gives us a sense of what might happen. But in any case, having gotten the last word, because I get to, that kind of frames the disagreement that Robert and I have, and the kinds of disagreements that we have at Stratfor. It's extremely important to understand that within the Stratfor family, these things are seriously debated, and we go back and read Thucydides and Shakespeare and Greek tragedy, and we really try to understand what, at the moment of crisis, moves a person. It's an imperfect science, to say the least, even at 100 years or 10 years or whatever. But it's what we try to do. It's what we care about. The difference between intelligence and journalism is intelligence worries about what's coming next. Journalism is worrying about what just happened. And both have a place, but that is the fundamental difference, and that's the difference that Robert and I are discussing because Robert is a journalist, and I'm not, and we come from different mindsets. And Robert, if you'd like to say something?
I would just say that journalism could be better if it was more analytical, more unsentimental, it was Robert Musil, the great Austrian novelist of the early mid-20th century, who said the truth emerges when the blood runs cold. In other words, the less passion, the less sentimentality journalists bring to an issue, the more accurate they're going to turn out to be. At the same time, geopolitical forecasters could be better at their work if they took into account some of the practices of journalism, because what journalists bring in is the human element.
On that note, I'd like to thank Robert for joining us today and joining our organization, and for starting a conversation that will last for many months and years, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you.